The evening began like any other, but for Sandra Bullock it carried a weight she couldn't quite shake off. She had received an invitation to one of the most exclusive charity galas in Beverly Hills, a glittering event attended by the creme de la creme of society. It wasn't just about the glitz and glamour. This gala was raising funds for a cause close to her heart. Sandra didn't care much for high-profile parties or rubbing shoulders with the rich and famous, but supporting meaningful causes was something she believed in deeply. So, despite her reservations, she accepted the invite. On the day of the gala, Sandra spent hours preparing. She chose a simple yet elegant black dress that hugged her figure perfectly without being overly flashy. To her, the focus should always be on the purpose of the event, not on who wore what or how expensive their jewelry was. After slipping into her heels and applying light makeup, she glanced at herself in the mirror. Her reflection showed a confident woman, but deep down she felt a flicker of unease. Sandra knew these events were often less about charity and more about showcasing wealth and status. Still, she reminded herself that she was there to make a difference, not to impress anyone. As Sandra arrived at the venue, the scene outside took her breath away, not because of its beauty but because of its extravagance. Stretched limousines lined the driveway, their polished surfaces gleaming under the bright lights. Men in tailored suits and women draped in designer gowns stepped out of luxury cars, their laughter echoing through the crisp night air. Paparazzi swarmed the entrance, snapping photos of every guest as they made their way inside. Sandra parked, her modest sedan a little farther away, preferring to avoid the chaos. As she walked toward the building, clutching her small clutch bag, she couldn't help but feel slightly out of place. Inside, the grand ballroom sparkled with opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the room. Tables adorned with pristine white tablecloths and towering floral centerpieces filled the space. Waiters moved gracefully between guests, offering trays of champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres. The hum of conversation blended with soft instrumental music, creating an atmosphere both lively and refined. Yet, amidst all the splendor, Sandra felt a strange disconnect. She scanned the room, recognizing a few familiar faces, celebrities, business tycoons, and socialites. But most of the attendees seemed absorbed in their own worlds, exchanging pleasantries that lacked genuine warmth. Almost immediately, Sandra became aware of the curious glances directed her way. Some people smiled politely when they noticed her, while others whispered behind raised hands. She tried to brush it off, reminding herself that such reactions were inevitable in environments like this. But as she approached the registration desk to check in, she overheard fragments of conversations that made her pause. "Oh, look, isn't that Sandra Bullock?" one woman murmured to her companion, her tone laced with disdain. "I heard she doesn't even belong in this circle." Yes," another replied, her voice dripping with condescension. "She's nice enough, I suppose, but let's be honest. She's no Angelina Jolie or Kate Blanchett, hardly elite material." Sandra froze for a moment, pretending to adjust her earrings so no one would notice her discomfort. These comments weren't new to her. She'd faced similar remarks throughout her career. But hearing them now, in this setting, stung more than usual. She reminded herself that these people didn't define her value. Still, the words lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. Determined not to let negativity ruin her evening, Sandra forced a smile and continued into the ballroom. A server handed her a glass of champagne, which she accepted gratefully. Taking a sip, she wandered around the edges of the room, admiring the artwork displayed for auction and reading the descriptions of various charitable projects supported by the gala. Each project aimed to uplift marginalized communities, provide education to underprivileged children, or offer medical aid to those in need. Sandra found solace in these details, knowing that her presence here contributed to something far greater than superficial appearances. Despite her efforts to stay focused on the positive aspects of the event, Sandra couldn't ignore the whispers, following her wherever she went. At one point, she joined a small group discussing the importance of philanthropy. Initially, the conversation flowed smoothly, with everyone sharing stories of their involvement in charitable work. However, when the topic shifted to personal achievements, Sandra noticed subtle changes in the group's demeanor. One man boasted about his multi-million-dollar donation to a prestigious university, while a woman bragged about organizing a fundraising gala that raised millions overnight. When it came time for Sandra to speak, she hesitated, unsure whether to share her contributions. In the past, she had donated anonymously to avoid drawing attention to herself. Now she wondered if her silence might be misinterpreted as a lack of commitment. Before long, Sandra excused herself from the group and retreated to a quieter corner of the room. Standing near a large window overlooking the city skyline, she sipped her champagne and reflected on why she had come tonight. Was it worth enduring the judgmental stares and cutting remarks? Just as doubt began to creep in, she spotted someone entering the ballroom late, someone whose arrival commanded immediate attention. Little did she know this person would change the course of her evening entirely. Sandra stood by the window, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her champagne glass. She had hoped to find some peace in this corner of the ballroom, away from the prying eyes and whispered judgments. But even here, she wasn't entirely free from scrutiny. A group of impeccably dressed women nearby seemed to be glancing her way, their expressions unreadable, but undeniably pointed. Sandra tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the distant city lights beyond the window. Still, it was impossible not to feel their gaze boring into her. Before long, one of the women broke away from the group and sauntered over to where Sandra stood. Her name was Victoria Langley, a well-known socialite whose sharp tongue and cutting remarks were legendary among Beverly Hills circles. Clad in an extravagant emerald gown that shimmered with every step, Victoria exuded confidence. Perhaps too much so. She approached Sandra with a practiced smile, though her cold blue eyes betrayed no warmth. Well, Victoria began, her voice carrying just enough sweetness to sound insincere. If it isn't Sandra Bullock. I must admit, I didn't expect to see you here tonight. Sandra turned slowly, meeting Victoria's gaze with polite indifference. Hello, she replied simply, keeping her tone neutral. It's nice to meet you. Victoria tilted her head slightly as if inspecting Sandra like a specimen under a microscope. Nice to meet me, she echoed, feigning surprise. Darling, everyone knows who I am. The real question is why someone like you would grace us with your presence at such an exclusive event. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sandra felt her stomach tighten, but she refused to let Victoria see her discomfort. Instead, she offered a small, tight-lipped smile. I'm here because I care about the cause, she said evenly. That's all that matters, isn't it? Victoria chuckled lightly, though there was no humor in the sound. Oh, darling, of course the cause matters, but let's be honest. Charity. Galas like this aren't just about giving back. They're about connections, influence, status. She paused, letting her words sink in before adding, and frankly, you don't strike me as someone who fits in here. At that moment, two other women joined Victoria, forming a semicircle around Sandra. Both wore designer gowns and carried themselves with an air of superiority that made Sandra feel even more out of place. One of them, a tall blonde named Penelope, smirked as she leaned closer. You know, Sandra, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. You've done well for yourself. Really, you have. But sometimes success can go to people's heads. You might want to remember your roots before trying to climb too high. Sandra blinked, momentarily stunned by the audacity of the comment. Her roots? She had worked tirelessly for everything she had achieved, building her career from the ground up without relying on privilege or family wealth. Yet these women acted as though she had stumbled into fame by accident, undeserving of her accomplishments. She opened her mouth to respond, but another voice cut through the tension. Speaking of climbing too high, interjected the third woman, a brunette with piercing green eyes. Did you hear about her last film? Honestly, I thought it was underwhelming. Not exactly Oscar-worthy material, if you ask me. The trio erupted into giggles, their laughter ringing hollow in Sandra's ears. She clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to defend herself. These women weren't interested in hearing her perspective. They only wanted to tear her down for sport. Every word they spoke was calculated, designed to make her feel small and insignificant. As the insults continued, Sandra found herself retreating inward. She reminded herself that their opinions didn't define her worth. Still, the barrage of negativity was hard to endure. It wasn't just the criticism itself. It was the casual cruelty with which it was delivered, as though mocking someone else's achievements was second nature to them. Sandra wondered how anyone could live like this, constantly seeking validation by putting others down. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Sandra excused herself with a curt nod. "If you'll excuse me," she said stiffly, setting her half-empty champagne glass on a nearby table. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She moved quickly, weaving through clusters of guests until she reached a secluded alcove near the back of the ballroom. Here, surrounded by towering potted plants and dim lighting, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. Leaning against the wall, she closed her eyes and pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to steady her racing thoughts. What had possessed her to come here tonight? Why had she subjected herself to this kind of humiliation? Just as self-doubt began creeping in, Sandra heard faint murmurs nearby. Opening her eyes, she saw a young server hovering uncertainly at the edge of the alcove, holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres. He looked nervous, as if unsure whether he should approach her. Sandra gave him a reassuring smile and shook her head gently. "Thank you," she said softly. "But I'm fine." The server nodded and retreated, leaving Sandra alone once more. She glanced toward the main part of the ballroom, where the glittering crowd continued to mingle and laugh. From her vantage point, she could see Victoria and her cohorts holding court, drawing attention with their loud voices and dramatic gestures. Sandra couldn't help but marvel at how effortlessly they commanded the room, wielding their wealth and status like weapons. To them, this gala wasn't about making a difference, it was about maintaining power dynamics and asserting dominance. But as Sandra watched, something shifted. The energy in the room changed subtly, almost imperceptibly. Conversations paused. Mid-sentence, heads turned, and a collective hush fell over the crowd. Curious, Sandra stepped out of the alcove to investigate. That's when she saw him. Keanu Reeves had arrived, dressed in a sleek black suit that fit him perfectly. Keanu strode into the ballroom with an understated elegance that immediately drew attention. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his warm, brown eyes scanned the room with quiet curiosity. Despite his star power, there was nothing pretentious about his demeanor. He carried himself with humility and ease, as though completely unaware of the stir he caused. Guests parted to make way, for him some whispering excitedly while others stared openly. Keanu ignored the commotion, his focus unwavering as he searched for someone in particular. Sandra watched from afar, her heart lifting at the sight of her dear friend. She hadn't known he'd been invited to the gala, but his presence was a welcome surprise. When Keanu finally spotted Sandra standing off to the side, his face lit up with genuine affection. He made a beeline for her, brushing past admirers and ignoring the curious stares of those around him. As he approached, Sandra felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time that evening, she wasn't alone. "Hey, stranger," Keanu greeted her warmly, pulling her into a quick hug. His embrace was comforting, grounding her in a way nothing else could. "Fancy seeing you here." Sandra laughed softly, grateful for his timing. "Keanu, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief and gratitude. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied with a grin. Then, noticing the tension still lingering in her expression, his smile softened. "Are you okay?" For a moment, Sandra hesitated. Part of her wanted to brush off the earlier incident, to pretend everything was fine. But looking into Keanu's kind eyes, she realized she didn't have to put on a brave face for him. He already knew her too well. "I'm all right," she admitted quietly. "Just having an interesting evening." Keanu raised an eyebrow, his protective instincts kicking in. "Interesting how?" Before Sandra could answer, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned again, and Sandra followed their gazes to see Victoria and her clique watching them intently. Their expressions ranged from mild curiosity to thinly veiled disdain. Clearly, they were speculating about Keanu's sudden appearance and his obvious connection to Sandra. Keanu noticed their stares and frowned slightly. Turning back to Sandra, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Whatever's going on," he said firmly, "you don't have to deal with it alone. We're in this together." Sandra felt a lump rise in her throat. She had always admired Keanu's loyalty and kindness, but tonight his support meant more than ever. With him by her side, she knew she could face anything, even the judgmental elite of Beverly Hills. Little did they know, Keanu wasn't just here to offer comfort. He had plans of his own, plans that would leave Victoria and her friends reeling. Keanu's arrival had already shifted the energy of the gala, but what happened next would leave an indelible mark on everyone present. Sandra looked up at him, her gratitude evident in her eyes, though she still felt a lingering sting from the earlier humiliation. Keanu could sense it too. Her quiet strength was masking something deeper. He wasn't just here to support his friend. He was determined to make sure no one treated her poorly ever again, especially not these shallow society women who hid behind their wealth and status. "Let's get out of this corner," Keanu suggested gently, offering Sandra his arm. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if stepping back into the spotlight was wise, but then nodded. Taking a deep breath, she linked her arm with his, feeling a renewed sense of confidence as they walked together toward the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted naturally for them, some guests whispering excitedly about Keanu's unexpected entrance while others openly gawked at the unlikely duo. As they moved through the room, Keanu kept his focus entirely on Sandra, shielding her from the curious stares around them. His protective demeanor sent a clear message. Anyone who dared to say or do anything disrespectful would have to answer to him. This subtle yet unmistakable display of solidarity didn't go unnoticed by Victoria and her clique, who were now watching intently from across the room. Their smug expressions faltered slightly, replaced by puzzled frowns. They couldn't quite figure out why someone like Keanu Reeves would show such obvious affection and loyalty to Sandra Bullock. The two friends finally reached a quieter section near the stage, where organizers were preparing for the next segment of the evening, a series of speeches from key donors and sponsors. Keanu glanced around, taking stock of the situation before turning to Sandra. "Tell me everything," he said softly, his voice firm but kind. "What happened?" Sandra hesitated, reluctant to relive the painful encounter. But Keanu's steady gaze reassured her that she could trust him completely. In hushed tones, she recounted the humiliating comments made by Victoria and her group, the snide remarks about her career, her supposed lack of elite status, and even the thinly veiled insults about her appearance and contributions. As she spoke, Keanu's expression darkened, though he remained calm. When she finished, he exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "You don't deserve any of that," he said firmly, his voice low enough that only Sandra could hear. "And I'm going to make sure they know it." Before Sandra could protest, the MC stepped onto the stage, announcing that it was time for the donor recognition portion of the program. Several high-profile attendees were called up to share brief remarks about their involvement with the charity. Each speaker took the microphone, praising themselves and their generosity, while subtly name-dropping other influential figures in attendance. It was all very predictable and very self-serving. When the last scheduled speaker concluded their speech, the MC prepared to thank everyone and move on to the next activity. But just as he was about to step away from the podium, Keanu suddenly appeared beside him. There was no fanfare, no grand announcement, just Keanu, walking confidently up to the stage with a quiet authority that commanded attention. The entire room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. "I hope you'll indulge me for a moment," Keanu began, his voice warm but carrying an undeniable edge. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight, but sometimes opportunities arise when you least expect them, and you realize you can't let them pass." A ripple of curiosity spread through the audience. No one knew what to expect. They weren't used to celebrities using events like this to deviate from the script. Sandra watched from the sidelines, her heart pounding. She had no idea what Keanu was about to say, but she trusted him implicitly. "I'd like to take a moment to talk about someone who truly embodies the spirit of giving," Keanu continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on Sandra. "Someone whose contributions often go unnoticed because she chooses to give quietly, without seeking recognition or applause." Heads turned toward Sandra, who stood frozen in place, caught off guard by the sudden spotlight. Keanu smiled warmly at her, his admiration evident for all to see. "Sandra Bullock isn't just an incredible actress," he went on. "She's also one of the most generous and compassionate people I've ever met. Over the years, she has donated millions to countless causes, everything from disaster relief efforts to education initiatives, all while keeping her actions private. She believes in helping others without needing public validation, which is something we should all admire." The room was utterly silent now, every guest hanging on Keanu's words. Even Victoria and her clique looked stunned, their earlier smugness evaporating as they realized they had grossly misjudged Sandra. Keanu wasn't done yet, though. "In fact," he added, leaning slightly into the microphone, "Sandra has been supporting this very foundation for years, contributing under pseudonyms to ensure the focus stays on the cause rather than on herself. She does it because she genuinely cares, not because she wants to be seen as elite or important." At this point, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some attendees exchanged shocked glances, while others nodded appreciatively, realizing how wrong they had been to dismiss Sandra earlier. Victoria's face flushed red, her perfectly manicured nails gripping the edge of her champagne glass tightly. Her companions shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting their earlier behavior. Keanu wrapped up his impromptu speech with a heartfelt reminder. "True generosity isn't about how much money you have or how many connections you boast. It's about the impact you make and the lives you touch. And if anyone here doubts that, I encourage you to look at Sandra as an example of what real giving looks like." With that, Keanu stepped away from the podium, leaving the audience buzzing with excitement and admiration. Applause erupted spontaneously, growing louder as more people joined in. Sandra stood rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by emotion. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, managing a small smile as she met Keanu's gaze across the room. He gave her a wink, signaling that everything was going to be all right. As the applause continued, guests began approaching Sandra, eager to apologize and express their newfound respect. Some praised her humility and dedication, while others admitted they hadn't realized the extent of her philanthropy. Sandra accepted their words graciously, though she couldn't help but notice the insincerity in some apologies, particularly those coming from Victoria and her clique. Still, she chose to rise above it, focusing on the positive energy now filling the room. Meanwhile, Keanu mingled effortlessly among the crowd, deflecting compliments about his speech with characteristic modesty. He deflected attention back to the charity's mission, encouraging guests to continue supporting meaningful causes rather than dwelling on social hierarchies. His charisma and authenticity won over even the most skeptical attendees, further cementing his reputation as a genuine and down-to-earth person. By the end of the evening, the tone of the gala had shifted dramatically. What had started as a superficial display of wealth and status transformed into a celebration of kindness and humanity, thanks largely to Keanu's intervention. Sandra, once humiliated and isolated, now found herself surrounded by admirers who finally understood the depth of her character, and though she knew not everyone's change of heart was sincere, she appreciated the gesture nonetheless. As the night wound down, Sandra and Keanu shared a quiet moment outside the venue, standing beneath the starlit sky. "Thank you," Sandra said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Keanu replied with a shrug. "Because you're my friend, and no one gets to treat you like anything less than extraordinary." Sandra smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time that evening, she truly believed it. The revelation Keanu had made during his impromptu speech sent ripples through the gala, transforming the atmosphere in ways no one could have anticipated. As guests flocked to Sandra, offering apologies and compliments, she found herself at the center of an entirely different kind of attention, one that felt both foreign and overwhelming. For years, Sandra had deliberately stayed out of the limelight when it came to her charitable work, believing that true generosity didn't require applause or recognition. Now, however, she was being celebrated for exactly what she had always tried to keep hidden. At first, Sandra struggled to process the sudden shift. People who had earlier dismissed her as not elite enough were now clamoring for her time, eager to shake her hand or share their admiration. A prominent businessman approached her, gushing about how inspiring her humility was. "You're a class act, Sandra," he said earnestly, though his tone carried a hint of regret for having underestimated her earlier. Another guest, a well-known philanthropist, expressed awe at the scale of Sandra's contributions, admitting she hadn't realized how deeply involved Sandra was with various causes. Sandra responded to each interaction with grace, thanking people politely and steering conversations back to the purpose of the evening, raising funds for those in need. Despite her composed exterior, she couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: gratitude for Keanu's unwavering support, relief at finally being seen for who she truly was, and a lingering sadness over the superficial nature of some of the praise. She knew not everyone meant what they said. Some were simply trying to save face after misjudging her so harshly. Meanwhile, Victoria and her clique stood on the sidelines, watching the scene unfold with growing unease. Their earlier mockery of Sandra now seemed petty and cruel in light of Keanu's revelations. Penelope, the tall blonde from earlier, leaned toward Victoria and whispered, "Do you think she'll hold a grudge? I mean, we were pretty brutal." Victoria pursed her lips, clearly irritated but unwilling to admit fault. "She won't say anything publicly," she muttered dismissively. "Celebrities like her thrive on forgiveness. It makes them look good." Her words lacked conviction, however, betraying the guilt gnawing at her conscience. Despite their attempts to downplay the situation, Victoria and her friends couldn't ignore the whispers spreading around the room. Other guests openly discussed Sandra's philanthropic efforts, marveling at her selflessness and discretion. Some even criticized Victoria's group for their earlier behavior, calling them petty and judgmental. The once unshakable confidence of these society women began to crumble under the weight of public opinion. As the night progressed, Sandra retreated briefly to gather her thoughts. Standing near a quiet corner of the ballroom, she sipped a glass of water and reflected on the whirlwind of events. She felt grateful for Keanu's intervention, which had not only restored her dignity, but also highlighted the importance of authenticity in a world obsessed with appearances. Still, she wondered how long this newfound respect would last. Would these people remember her kindness tomorrow, or would they return to their old habits of gossip and elitism? Keanu joined her shortly afterward, sensing her introspection. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly, his voice filled with genuine concern. "I'm okay," Sandra replied, managing a small smile. "It's just a lot to take in. I never wanted any of this attention. All I've ever wanted is to help where I can, quietly and without fanfare." Keanu nodded, understanding her perspective completely. "I know," he said, "but sometimes shining a light on good deeds reminds people of what really matters. Maybe tonight will inspire others to follow your lead." Sandra considered his words, finding comfort in their truth. While she preferred anonymity, she couldn't deny the potential impact of showing others that wealth and status weren't prerequisites for making a difference. Perhaps Keanu's actions would encourage more people to focus on meaningful contributions rather than superficial displays of power. Back in the main part of the ballroom, the organizers announced the start of the live auction, a highlight of the evening designed to raise additional funds for the charity. Guests eagerly raised their paddles, bidding generously on luxury items like vacations, artwork, and designer accessories. Sandra watched from afar, pleased to see the enthusiasm translate into tangible support for the cause. However, the most memorable moment of the auction came when a unique item was introduced: a private dinner with Keanu Reeves himself. The announcement, drew gasps of excitement from the crowd and bids skyrocketed almost instantly. Sandra chuckled as she observed the frenzy, knowing full well that Keanu hadn't planned to participate in such a spectacle. But when he caught her eye and shrugged playfully, she realized he was embracing the opportunity to further support the foundation. "Looks like you're in high demand," Sandra teased as Keanu returned from the stage after the winning bid was placed. "It's all for a good cause," he replied with a grin. "Besides, if it helps raise money for something important, I'm happy to oblige." As the auction concluded, the gala transitioned into its final phase, a heartfelt closing ceremony. The event's host took the stage to thank everyone for their participation and generosity. He singled out Sandra once again, acknowledging her significant contributions, not just financially, but also as a role model of humility and compassion. The audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet to show their appreciation. Sandra blushed at the ovation, feeling both humbled and slightly uncomfortable with the attention. When the host invited her to say a few words, she hesitated before stepping onto the stage. Looking out at the sea of faces, she felt a surge of emotion but pushed through it, determined to leave the evening on a positive note. "Thank you all for your kind words tonight," she began, her voice steady, despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "But I want to remind everyone that the real heroes are the people working tirelessly behind the scenes to make a difference. My contributions pale in comparison to the dedication of volunteers, activists, and everyday individuals who give their time and energy to help others." Her speech resonated deeply with the audience, drawing nods of agreement and murmurs of approval. Sandra concluded by urging everyone to continue supporting causes they cared about, emphasizing that even small acts of kindness could create lasting change. As she stepped away from the microphone, the room erupted into another round of applause, this time more heartfelt and sincere. By the end of the evening, the gala had transformed into something far greater than anyone had expected. What had begun as a showcase of wealth and privilege became a celebration of humanity and generosity, thanks largely to Sandra's example and Keanu's advocacy. Guests left the venue with renewed perspectives, inspired to prioritize substance over superficiality. For Sandra, the night ended on a bittersweet note. She appreciated the validation she had received, but she remained grounded in her values, knowing that true fulfillment came from within. As she prepared to leave, Keanu accompanied her to her car, ensuring she felt safe and supported until the very end. "You handled everything beautifully," he told her as they stood beside her sedan. "Remember, none of this changes who you are. You're still the same amazing person you've always been." Sandra smiled, touched by his words. "Thank you for standing by me tonight," she said, "and for reminding everyone, including me, what really matters." With that, she climbed into her car and drove away, leaving behind the glittering world of Beverly Hills. Though the evening had tested her patience and resilience, it had also reinforced her belief in staying true to oneself. And as she glanced at the city lights fading in her rearview mirror, Sandra knew she wouldn't soon forget the lessons learned, or the friend who had helped her rise above it all. The days following the gala passed quickly, but the impact of that evening lingered in Sandra's mind like a quiet echo. She had returned to her normal routine, spending time on set, attending meetings, and continuing her work with various charities. But she couldn't shake the memory of how drastically the night had shifted from humiliation to validation. While part of her appreciated the newfound respect she had earned, another part worried about whether people's admiration was genuine or fleeting. Would they remember her kindness tomorrow, or would they revert to their old ways of judging others based on appearances? Sandra tried not to dwell on it too much. Instead, she focused on what truly mattered, the causes she supported, and the lives she hoped to improve through her efforts. Still, reminders of the gala kept finding their way back into her life. Social media buzzed with posts about her philanthropy, fans praised her humility online, and even some industry peers reached out to commend her for setting an example. It was flattering, yes, but also slightly uncomfortable. Sandra preferred staying behind the scenes, letting her actions speak louder than words. Now, however, she found herself thrust into the spotlight. Not because she sought it, but because Keanu's intervention had revealed aspects of her life she had long kept private. One morning, as Sandra arrived at a local coffee shop near her home, she noticed someone sitting at a corner table watching her intently. At first, she thought nothing of it. Being recognized in public wasn't unusual for her. But when the woman stood up and approached her, Sandra realized it was Victoria Langley, the same socialite who had mocked her so cruelly at the gala. For a moment, Sandra froze, unsure of what to expect. Was Victoria here to apologize? Or worse, to dig deeper into the wounds she had inflicted? Sandra? Victoria began hesitantly, her usual air of superiority replaced by something closer to awkwardness. May I have a word? Sandra nodded cautiously, gesturing toward an empty table nearby. They sat down across from each other, the tension between them palpable. Victoria fidgeted with her designer handbag, clearly struggling to find the right words. Finally, she spoke. I wanted to say, well, I owe you an apology. Sandra raised an eyebrow, surprised by the admission. An apology? She repeated, keeping her tone neutral. Victoria nodded, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Yes. What happened at the gala? It was wrong. My friends and we judged you unfairly, and after hearing everything Mr. Reeves said, I realized how shallow and thoughtless we were. You've done incredible things, Sandra, and none of us gave you the credit you deserved. Sandra studied Victoria's face, searching for sincerity. The woman's expression was contrite, her voice tinged with regret. Though Sandra had no reason to trust her, she decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. After all, everyone made mistakes, including herself, and holding grudges served no purpose. Thank you for saying that, Sandra replied softly. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and I appreciate your honesty. Victoria exhaled sharply, visibly relieved. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or ever really, but I hope you'll believe that I'm trying to do better. Seeing how gracefully you handled everything that night, it made me realize how far I still have to go. Sandra offered a small smile, touched by the sincerity of Victoria's words. We all grow in different ways, she said kindly. What matters is that you're willing to learn. That's a step in the right direction. Their conversation ended shortly afterward, with Victoria expressing gratitude for Sandra's understanding. As Sandra watched her walk away, she felt a sense of closure. Forgiveness wasn't always easy, but letting go of resentment allowed her to move forward without carrying unnecessary burdens. She left the coffee shop feeling lighter, as if shedding a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Meanwhile, Keanu remained a steadfast presence in Sandra's life, checking in regularly to ensure she was doing okay. He called her one evening, his voice warm and familiar over the phone. How are things on your end? He asked. Still dealing with any fallout from the gala? Sandra chuckled lightly, leaning back on her couch. Surprisingly, no. If anything, it's been strangely quiet. Well, except for Victoria showing up at my favorite coffee shop today to apologize. Keanu laughed, clearly amused. Wow, bold move. Did she grovel enough for you? It wasn't groveling, Sandra corrected him gently. She seemed genuinely sorry, which says a lot about her character. Not many people would swallow their pride like that. That's true, Keanu agreed. Still, I'm proud of you for handling it with grace. Most people wouldn't be so forgiving. I think forgiveness benefits both sides, Sandra mused. Holding on to anger only hurts you more in the long run. Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, and Sandra found herself laughing at one of Keanu's quirky stories about an encounter he'd had with an overly enthusiastic fan earlier that week. Talking to him always brought her comfort, reminding her why their friendship meant so much. Keanu had a way of grounding her, helping her see the bigger picture when life felt overwhelming. As the weeks went by, Sandra continued to focus on her passions, pouring her energy into projects that aligned with her values. She attended smaller charity events where the emphasis was less on glamour and more on community impact. These gatherings reminded her why she loved giving back. They were intimate, heartfelt, and free of pretense. Here, she didn't feel like an outsider. She belonged among people who shared her vision of making the world a better place. Back in Sandra, Beverly Hills, whispers about Sandra's philanthropy continued to circulate, though they eventually faded as attention shifted to other headlines. Victoria and her clique attempted to repair their reputations, hosting fundraisers and participating in volunteer work to prove they had changed. Whether their efforts stemmed from genuine remorse or a desire to save face remained unclear, but Sandra chose not to dwell on it. Actions spoke louder than words, and time would reveal whether their transformation was authentic. One day, while filming a scene for her latest project, Sandra received an unexpected visit from Keanu. He appeared on set unannounced, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing his signature laid-back charm. "Thought you could use a break," he said with a grin, handing her one of the cups. Sandra laughed, grateful for the surprise. "You know me too well," she teased, taking a sip of the steaming beverage. "But aren't you supposed to be halfway across the world shooting something epic?" "I am," Keanu admitted, "but I figured stopping by wouldn't hurt anyone. Besides, I wanted to check in before I head out." They spent the next hour chatting under the shade of a tree near the set, reminiscing about the gala and discussing future plans. Sandra mentioned a new initiative she was working on, a program aimed at providing educational resources to underprivileged children, and Keanu immediately offered to help. "Count me in," he said firmly. "If there's one thing I've learned from you, it's that real change starts with action." By the time Keanu left, Sandra felt reinvigorated, her determination stronger than ever. Having someone like Keanu in her corner reminded her that she wasn't alone in this journey. Together, they could amplify their efforts, inspiring others to join them in creating meaningful change. In the months that followed, Sandra's influence grew, not because of fame or fortune, but because of her unwavering commitment to doing good. People began to see her not just as an actress, but as a beacon of hope and resilience. Her story became a testament to the power of authenticity, proving that true worth came not from external validation, but from the choices we make and the lives we touch. And though the glittering world of high society remained as superficial as ever, Sandra knew she had carved out a space where kindness triumphed over cruelty, humility over arrogance, and substance over style. For her, that was victory enough. As the months rolled on, Sandra found herself reflecting more deeply on the lessons she had learned from the gala and its aftermath. Life had returned to a steady rhythm, but the ripple effects of that night continued to shape her perspective in subtle yet profound ways. She realized that while she couldn't control how others perceived her, she could choose how those perceptions influenced her actions. That realization became a guiding principle, a reminder to stay true to herself no matter what challenges arose. One crisp morning, Sandra decided to take a break from her busy schedule and visit a small park near her home. It was one of her favorite spots, a tranquil haven away from the chaos of Hollywood. She often came here to clear her mind, finding solace in the rustling leaves and chirping birds. As she strolled along the winding path, she noticed a familiar face sitting on a bench nearby. It was Victoria Langley. At first, Sandra hesitated, unsure if another encounter with Victoria would be productive or even welcome. But when their eyes met, Victoria smiled warmly and gestured for Sandra to join her. Reluctantly, Sandra approached, taking a seat beside her former critic. "Good morning," Victoria said softly, her tone far removed from the condescension Sandra had experienced at the gala. "I hope you don't mind me being here. I've started coming to this park regularly. It's peaceful." "It is," Sandra agreed, still wary but willing to give Victoria the benefit of the doubt. "It's nice to see you again," Victoria nodded, glancing down at her hands before looking up with a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "I wanted to thank you for everything, for accepting my apology back at the coffee shop, and for not holding a grudge. Not many people would have been so gracious." Sandra studied Victoria's expression carefully. There was no trace of the haughty socialite who had mocked her, Instead, she saw someone earnestly trying to grow. "We all make mistakes," Sandra replied gently. "What matters is learning from them, and it seems like you've been doing just that." Victoria's lips curved into a tentative smile. "I've been trying. After that night, I realized how much I'd let superficial things define me. The clothes I wore, the circles I moved in, the way I treated others. It wasn't until Keanu exposed your generosity that I understood how hollow all of that really was." Her words resonated deeply with Sandra, who had spent years navigating similar pressures in the entertainment industry. "I think we live in a world that values appearances over substance," Sandra said thoughtfully. "But real fulfillment comes from knowing you've made a difference, even if no one notices." Victoria nodded emphatically. "That's exactly what I've come to understand. Since then, I've been volunteering at shelters and mentoring young women through a nonprofit organization. It's humbling, but also incredibly rewarding." Sandra felt a swell of pride hearing this. Watching Victoria evolve from a judgmental socialite into someone genuinely committed to helping others reminded her of the transformative power of self-awareness and accountability. "I'm glad to hear that," Sandra said sincerely. "Actions speak louder than words, and it sounds like you're making a real impact." Their conversation flowed naturally after that, shifting from personal growth to shared interests. By the time they parted ways, Sandra felt a renewed sense of optimism. Not just about Victoria, but about humanity as a whole. People were capable of change, she realized, if given the chance and the right motivation. Later that week, Sandra attended a community event hosted by one of her favorite charities. The gathering was intimate, drawing together volunteers, donors, and beneficiaries alike. Unlike the glittering galas of Beverly Hills, this event celebrated grassroots efforts and tangible results. Children laughed as they played games, families shared meals under colorful tents, and volunteers worked tirelessly to ensure everyone felt welcomed and cared for. As Sandra mingled with attendees, she was struck by the authenticity of the interactions around her. No one was competing for attention or status. Instead, they were united by a common purpose: to uplift each other. She felt a deep sense of belonging, knowing she was part of something greater than herself. During the program, Sandra was invited to say a few words. Standing before the crowd, she took a moment to gather her thoughts, feeling grateful for the opportunity to connect with such compassionate individuals. "When I first started supporting charitable causes," she began, her voice warm and heartfelt, "I did it quietly because I believed that giving shouldn't be about recognition. But over time, I've learned that shining a light on good deeds can inspire others to do the same." She paused, scanning the sea of faces before continuing. "Tonight, I want to remind everyone here that every act of kindness matters, no matter how big or small. Whether it's volunteering your time, donating resources, or simply offering a listening ear, you're making a difference. And sometimes those differences ripple outward in ways we can't even imagine." The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the park. Sandra stepped back, overwhelmed by the outpouring of gratitude. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly seen, not as an actress or a celebrity, but as a human being dedicated to creating positive change. In the weeks that followed, Sandra continued to prioritize projects aligned with her values. She collaborated with Keanu on several initiatives, including a campaign to provide educational tools to underserved schools. Together, they traveled to different cities, meeting students and teachers whose lives had been transformed by access to better resources. These experiences reinforced Sandra's belief in the importance of collective action, how working together amplified individual efforts exponentially. Back in Los Angeles, Sandra occasionally crossed paths with Victoria, who had become increasingly involved in philanthropy. Their friendship blossomed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared goals. Though their backgrounds were vastly different, they bonded over their desire to create meaningful change. Sandra admired Victoria's dedication, while Victoria looked up to Sandra as a mentor and role model. One evening, as Sandra prepared for bed, she received a text message from Keanu. It read, "You've inspired more people than you'll ever know, including me." Keep shining, my friend. A smile spread across Sandra's face as she read the words. Despite the challenges she had faced, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be, surrounded by people who valued kindness, humility, and authenticity. Fame and fortune might have opened doors for her, but it was her character that defined her legacy. Months later, Sandra stood backstage at a film festival, waiting to accept an award for her latest project. As she listened to the host praise her career achievements, she reflected on how far she had come since that fateful gala. The humiliation she had endured had taught her resilience, while the revelations that followed had reaffirmed her faith in humanity. Most importantly, she had emerged stronger, not because of external validation, but because she had stayed true to herself. When her name was called, Sandra walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. Holding the trophy aloft, she thanked her team, her fans, and her loved ones before delivering a final message to the audience. "Success isn't measured by accolades or wealth," she said firmly. "It's measured by the lives you touch and the love you share. So go out there and make a difference in whatever way feels right to you, because in the end, that's what truly matters." As she exited the stage, Sandra felt a profound sense of peace. The journey hadn't always been easy, but it had been worth it. She had proven to herself and to the world that staying authentic in the face of adversity was its own reward. And with friends like Keanu by her side, she knew she could handle anything life threw her way. The story closed with Sandra stepping into the cool night air, her heart full and her spirit unshaken. The city lights twinkled above her, a reminder of the endless possibilities ahead. Whatever the future held, she was ready to face it with courage, compassion, and unwavering integrity.